December 15, 1943, 1:47 p.m. San Pietro in Fine, Italy. Corporal Anthony Acevedo crouched behind the crumbling stone wall of the Chiesa di San Pietro, 300 yards from the nearest American position. 29 German soldiers moved through the olive grove below, advancing on the church where 42 wounded Americans lay waiting for evacuation. Acevedo had a Springfield rifle, 8 clips of ammunition and 4 grenades. No radio. No support. No chance. In the next 6 hours, this 23-year-old son of a Los Angeles mechanic would kill or wound every single German soldier who tried to take that church. The Japanese-American corporal, fighting with a segregated unit in Italy while his parents sat in an internment camp in Arizona, would hold a position that 3 German officers later testified should have fallen in 20 minutes. He'd do it using a tactic so unorthodox that the Army would classify his after-action report for 18 months, not because it contained secrets, but because it contradicted every principle of defensive doctrine taught at Fort Benning. What happened in that bell tower didn't follow the manual. It shouldn't have worked. But it saved 42 lives, changed how the Army trained soldiers for urban combat, and created a legacy that modern special forces still study. This is the story of how one man turned a church into a fortress using nothing but stubbornness, a dead German's rifle, and his father's lessons about automobile timing. Anthony Acevedo grew up in Boyle Heights, Los Angeles, with grease under his fingernails and a reputation for fixing things that shouldn't be fixable. His father ran a small garage on 4th Street, specializing in cars other mechanics had given up on. By 14, Anthony could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. By 16, he'd rebuilt a 1932 Ford Flathead using parts from 3 junkyards and timed it so precisely it ran smoother than factory spec. His teachers called him stubborn. His father called it focused. When Anthony decided something needed fixing, he didn't stop until it worked, even if he had to invent new tools or ignore the repair manual entirely. The book tells you how it's supposed to work, his father would say, elbow deep in a transmission. But every machine has its own personality. You gotta listen to what it's actually doing. That philosophy nearly got Anthony expelled from high school when he rewired the shop class engine to run in reverse, proving to his instructor that the textbook's explanation of valve timing was wrong. It definitely got him noticed by Army recruiters in December 1941, right after Pearl Harbor, when the whole neighborhood lined up to enlist. The Army didn't know what to do with Japanese Americans in 1942. Acevedo's parents were Nisei, second-generation Americans born in California. That made Anthony Sansei third-generation as American as anyone. Didn't matter. Executive Order 9066 sent his parents to the Gila River internment camp in Arizona in March 1942. Anthony, already inducted, got assigned to the 100th Infantry Battalion, a segregated unit of Japanese-American soldiers that the brass didn't trust and the public didn't want. They shipped the 100th to North Africa for training, keeping them away from the Pacific Theater where, the thinking went, they might be confused with the enemy. Never mind that Italian and German soldiers looked nothing like Japanese troops. Never mind that the 100th soldiers spoke English, ate hamburgers and sang God Bless America, with more conviction than most. They were different, so they got isolated. Acevedo adapted. He always did. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi before deployment, he'd fixed the motor pool's jeeps, repaired a broken machine gun mount using a crankshaft bracket, and jury-rigged a field radio that officers swore couldn't be repaired. He approached military equipment the same way he'd approached broken carburetors. Figure out what it's actually doing, not what the manual says it should do. His platoon sergeant, an Italian-American from Brooklyn named Tony Lombardi, recognized the quality. "You got good hands, Acevedo," Lombardi told him during a training exercise. "Steady. You don't panic when shit breaks." Lombardi made him an assistant gunner, then a scout, positions that required improvisation and calm under pressure. But Acevedo had a problem with authority when he thought authority was wrong. He'd argue with lieutenants about tactics, with captains about equipment maintenance, with anyone who insisted on doing things by the book when the book clearly didn't match reality. It earned him respect from enlisted men and headaches from officers. Corporal Acevedo has excellent technical skills and poor judgment regarding chain of command, one evaluation read. Recommend he remain in his current rank until he learns appropriate military bearing. That evaluation was written in August 1943. By December, Acevedo had been in combat for 4 months, fighting up the Italian peninsula in conditions that made training look like a pleasant summer camp. The 100th had landed at Salerno in September, pushed north through mountains that favored defenders, and learned that German soldiers were very good at their jobs. Acevedo watched men die in ways the training films never showed. Private James Kondo from Seattle caught a sniper round through the throat on October 3 while crossing a stone bridge near Benevento. He drowned in his own blood before the medic reached him, making a wet gurgling sound that Acevedo heard in his dreams for years. Sergeant Harold Fujimoto, who taught Acevedo how to zero his rifle, stepped on a shoe mine near Casino on November 12. The small wooden mine, almost undetectable, removed his foot at the ankle. He bled out in 7 minutes despite 2 tourniquets. Corporal Richard Hayashi died on November 28, shot through the chest during a night patrol. He'd been 20 feet from Acevedo when it happened, close enough that Acevedo heard the bullet hit, a wet smack like a fist hitting raw meat. Hayashi fell without a sound, dead before he landed. They'd grown up 3 blocks apart in Los Angeles, had known each other since elementary school. Acevedo helped carry the body back to American lines, Hayashi's blood soaking through his uniform. By early December 1943, the 100th had a casualty rate of 38%. 38%. More than 1 in 3 soldiers killed or wounded in 3 months. The battalion that the Army hadn't trusted, hadn't wanted, that trained in isolation and fought in obscurity, had the highest casualty rate in the entire Fifth Army. The problem wasn't courage. The problem was doctrine. American infantry tactics in 1943 emphasized aggressive movement and overwhelming firepower. The idea was simple: identify the enemy, fix them with suppressing fire, maneuver to flank, and assault with maximum force. It worked beautifully in training exercises at Fort Benning where the terrain was open and the enemy predictable. It didn't work in the Italian mountains where German soldiers fought from prepared positions on high ground, where every hilltop had interlocking fields of fire, where medieval stone buildings became fortresses, and where American soldiers attacking uphill got cut to pieces. Acevedo saw the pattern. Attack would start with artillery, which Germans weathered in deep bunkers. Infantry would advance under covering fire, which Germans evaded by retreating to secondary positions. Americans would rush forward thinking they'd broken through, and Germans would emerge from concealed positions at close range with machine guns and grenades. Then Americans would die. Officers called it bad luck. Acevedo called it bad tactics. "We're doing exactly what they expect," he told Lombardi after a disastrous attack near Monte Lungo cost the platoon 6 men in 15 minutes. "We telegraph every move. Artillery means we're coming. Covering fire means we're moving. We might as well send them a telegram." "So what do you suggest?" Lombardi asked, angry and grieving and exhausted. "We sit here and wait for them to leave? I suggest we stop fighting like the manual says and start fighting like they don't expect. That's called insubordination, Corporal. That's called staying alive, Sergeant." The argument went nowhere. Doctrine came from division, division came from Fifth Army, Fifth Army came from the War Department in Washington. Nobody wanted to hear that a corporal from a segregated unit thought the manual was wrong. So men kept dying in predictable ways, and Acevedo kept fixing rifles and radios and trying not to think about how many of his friends had been killed following orders that made no tactical sense. San Pietro in Fine sat in a valley 10 miles south of Casino, a small medieval town of stone buildings and narrow streets. The Germans held the high ground north of town, the Americans held positions south and west. Between them, the Chiesa di San Pietro, a 16th-century church with a bell tower that overlooked the main approach route. On December 15, that church held 42 wounded Americans waiting for evacuation after a morning attack went wrong. The plan had been to take the high ground north of town. The reality had been German mortars, machine gun crossfire, and Americans retreating under casualties. Medics had used the church as a collection point, figuring it was protected by the Geneva Convention and far enough from the fighting to be safe. They figured wrong. At 1:30 p.m., Acevedo's squad got orders to pull back to the main American line. The morning attack had failed, German counterattack was expected, and battalion wanted everyone consolidated for defense. The wounded in the church would be evacuated after dark, assuming the Germans didn't shell it first. "Assuming a lot," Acevedo muttered, watching German infantry moving through the olive groves east of town. They were advancing in squad-sized elements, not attacking, just probing, looking for weak points in isolated positions. Looking, he realized, exactly like men preparing to clear a building. He counted positions. The nearest American foxhole was 300 yards southwest of the church. The church itself sat in a slight depression, invisible from that position because of a stone wall and a burned-out farmhouse. If Germans took the church, the Americans wouldn't even know until they heard the shooting. And 42 wounded men couldn't run, couldn't fight, could barely move, Acevedo, you coming or you planning to admire the scenery until the Germans shoot you? Lombardi called from 50 yards away. Acevedo looked at the church. Looked at the Germans. Looked at Lombardi. Sergeant, someone needs to stay with the wounded. There's 2 medics in there. That's their job. Medics aren't armed. If the Germans come, 1 rifleman won't make a damn difference. Now move your ass, Corporal. Lombardi was right by the manual. Wrong by every other measure. Acevedo felt something settle in his chest, the same feeling he got working on an engine when he knew exactly what needed fixing and exactly how much trouble he'd get into for fixing it his way instead of the proper way. Can't do it, Sergeant. Someone's gotta stay. Lombardi stared at him. That's an order, Corporal. Yes, Sergeant. I understand. Acevedo. I'll catch up after dark. Tell the lieutenant I'm staying to protect the wounded. Tell him yourself when he courts-martials you. Lombardi held his stare for 5 seconds, then shook his head. Your funeral, Corporal. Literally. He turned and jogged after the rest of the squad, leaving Acevedo alone with his rifle, his ammunition, and his conviction that the manual could go to hell if it meant abandoning wounded men. He moved quickly. The church had thick stone walls, narrow windows, and a bell tower that offered a view of the surrounding terrain. Acevedo climbed the tower first, noting positions. Olive Grove to the east where Germans were moving, stone wall 40 yards north, burned farmhouse to the west, open ground everywhere else. The tower stairs were wooden, old, creaking with every step. The bell chamber had 4 open archways, 1 facing each direction, providing fields of fire but no cover. Original church bells were gone, probably melted for metal, leaving just the frame. The ceiling was slate tile supported by wooden beams. Acevedo studied the beams, the angles, the sight lines. His mind worked the problem like a timing chain. Action and reaction, movement and counter-movement, what happens if this breaks and how do I adapt? He saw it clearly, saw what needed to be done, saw how insane it was going to look. He went back down and found the senior medic, a thin man from Ohio named Patterson who looked about 18 but had seen enough wounded men to age him decades. Corporal, we're supposed to be evacuated at nightfall, Patterson said. You don't need to stay. How many can walk? Acevedo asked. Walk. Maybe 6. The others? Patterson gestured at men with chest wounds, gut wounds, shattered legs. They'd need stretchers. 4 men per stretcher. We'd need a whole platoon to move them, and that's if nobody shoots at us. Germans are moving east of here. Squad strength may be more. If they decide to clear this building before dark, you'll have about 10 minutes before they reach the door. Patterson's face went pale. We're protected. Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention works great when both sides agree to follow it. These aren't SS, but they're paratroopers, and paratroopers have a different opinion about tactical necessities. Acevedo checked his ammunition. 8 clips, 64 rounds. I'm staying in the tower. If they come, I'll try to make them rethink their plans. 1 man. 1 man who knows what he's doing. Keep the wounded quiet. If shooting starts, get everyone on the floor and stay there. He climbed back to the bell tower, moved the rifle rests into position and waited. The sun slanted through the western archway, warm on his face despite December cold. Below, German soldiers continued their advance through the olive trees, closer now, 200 yards, moving in textbook fashion with proper intervals and covering fire positions. Acevedo didn't have time for this to be fair or reasonable. He had time to make it work. He pulled out his pocket knife, found the rope that had once rung the church bell, and started cutting sections. His hands moved automatically, the same hands that had tied down carburetors and secured engine mounts, now preparing something the manual never covered. He worked fast, checking the Germans every 30 seconds. They were spreading out, preparing to sweep the area. He counted 29, saw their ranks. Mostly enlisted, 2 NCOs, 1 officer. Standard German infantry tactics. The officer directed movement, NCOs controlled fire, enlisted did the fighting. Basic concept, Acevedo thought. Control the head, confuse the body. His father's voice in his memory, an engine only knows what the carburetor tells it. Feed it the wrong mixture, the whole thing runs wrong. At 1:47 p.m., the German officer raised his hand and pointed at the church. The Germans came in 2 groups. First group, 8 men, moved directly toward the church from the east, using the olive trees for cover. Second group, 6 men, swung north to approach from that angle. Standard tactics. Fix the position with direct fire, flank from the side, assault once suppression was established. Acevedo let the first group get within 100 yards. He'd set his rifle on the stone sill of the east archway, propped against his pack for stability. The Springfield sight picture was clear. German sergeant, 42 years old maybe, experienced by his movement, carrying an MP-40 submachine gun. Acevedo breathed out slowly, squeezed. The Springfield kicked against his shoulder. The German sergeant dropped instantly, headshot, dead before he processed sound. The other 7 scattered, diving behind trees and into irrigation ditches. Their training was excellent. Nobody panicked, nobody returned fire randomly, they simply found cover and waited for direction. The direction didn't come. Their officer was with the flanking group, out of sight behind the stone wall. The remaining NCO, a corporal, tried to organize a response, shouting orders in German. Acevedo shot him through the chest. 2 leaders down in 15 seconds. Now the Germans had a problem. Doctrine said to suppress the position with covering fire and maneuver to flank. But they couldn't see the position clearly, just the church tower somewhere in that bell chamber, and they'd lost both leaders from their assault group. The flanking group was still moving, unaware of what had happened. Acevedo rotated to the north archway. The flanking group emerged from behind the stone wall, 6 men moving quickly across open ground toward the church's north entrance. They expected to hit the building while the assault group kept defenders busy. Instead, they ran into the open with nobody suppressing anything. Acevedo shot the first man at 90 yards. Missed the second, corrected, hit the third. The remaining 3 dropped flat, crawling backward toward the wall while Acevedo fired twice more, missing both times but keeping them pinned. He rotated back east. The original assault group was rallying, 3 men laying down machine gun fire on the tower while the others attempted to move forward. Bullets chipped stone, whined through the archways, forced Acevedo to duck back from the openings. This was where it got complicated. He needed to return fire, but exposing himself to the archway meant catching bullets from multiple angles. The Germans had him suppressed, exactly according to doctrine. In another minute, they'd maneuver close enough to either storm the tower or toss grenades through the openings. Acevedo grabbed the bell rope sections he'd prepared. 4 pieces, each about 3 feet long, each tied to a clip of ammunition. He positioned them at each archway, clips dangling at chest height inside the chamber, ropes running up to the wooden beams overhead. The Germans intensified fire. Bullets hammered stone, sending chips and dust through the air. Acevedo heard boots on gravel, men moving, the assault coming. He pulled hard on the east rope. The ammunition clip swung outward through the archway like a pendulum, visible for maybe 2 seconds before swinging back. But 2 seconds was enough. German machine gun fire tracked the movement, bullets following the clip, giving away exact firing positions. Acevedo was already at the south archway with his rifle up. He shot the machine gunner, worked the bolt, shot the man next to him. Both dropped. The 3rd German in that position fired wildly, hitting nothing, giving away his location. Acevedo put a round through the olive tree he was hiding behind. The bullet fragmented on wood, showered the German with splinters. He staggered back, exposed himself, caught the next round through the shoulder. Motion north. Acevedo rotated, saw 3 Germans rushing the entrance. He shot the lead man, missed the second, hit the third in the leg. The wounded man fell, screaming. The unwounded one dragged him back toward cover, brave and tactically stupid. Acevedo shot him through the back. The Germans pulled back. Acevedo checked his ammunition. 4 clips remaining, 32 rounds. He'd fired 32 rounds in maybe 3 minutes, killed or wounded 10 Germans, and forced a squad-level assault to break contact. Not bad for one man with a bolt-action rifle. But the Germans weren't leaving. They were regrouping, calling up their officer, preparing for round 2. And round 2 would involve mortars, grenades, smoke, everything they had. Acevedo needed more than clever rope tricks to survive that. He studied the tower structure. The wooden beams supporting the slate tile roof were old oak, 12 inches thick, running east-west across the chamber. The slate tiles were heavy, 2 inches thick, overlapping in traditional Italian style. Together they formed something like a roof. With modification they could form something like cover. Acevedo climbed onto the beam structure, testing weight distribution. The beams held. He grabbed slate tiles from the edges and repositioned them, creating a crude barrier between himself and the southern archway. It wasn't bulletproof, but it would stop shrapnel and deflect small arms fire. He built similar barriers at the other archways, using tiles and beam angles to create protected firing positions. His hands bled from sharp slate edges. Sweat soaked his uniform despite winter temperatures. Below, German voices shouted commands. He had maybe 5 minutes before they organized their next assault. In that 5 minutes, Acevedo turned the bell tower into a pillbox. He positioned ammunition clips at each firing port, rifle rests at each archway, escape routes planned if fire got too heavy. He memorized ranges to key terrain features: stone wall, olive trees, farmhouse, irrigation ditch. He calculated how long it would take Germans to cross each section of open ground and how many shots he could get off in that time. He was still calculating when the mortars started. The first rounds hit the church roof, 60 yards south of the tower. Germans were ranging in, walking the fire closer with each adjustment. Acevedo crouched behind his slate barrier, felt the building shake with each impact, heard the wounded men below crying out. The mortars walked north. Closer. Closer. One round hit the church's main structure, blowing out stained glass windows, sending colored glass fragments spinning through winter air. Another hit the western wall, spalling stone into dust. The tower shook. Slate tiles cracked and fell. Then the mortars stopped. In the silence, Acevedo heard German voices giving final instructions. The assault was coming. Full commitment this time, probably the entire platoon, 20+ men hitting from multiple angles simultaneously. He checked the Springfield. 5 rounds in the magazine. He grabbed a clip from his belt, thumbed the 5 rounds in, worked the bolt. Ready. The Germans came fast. Eastern Group, 8 men firing as they advanced. Northern Group, 6 men, using smoke for concealment. Western Group, 4 men, suppressing the tower with machine gun fire. Southern Group, 5 men, carrying satchel charges to blow the tower base. Acevedo shot the Southern Group first. They were the threat. The satchel charges could bring down the whole structure. He killed the lead man at 70 yards, hit the second in the chest at 60, missed the third, hit the fourth in the face at 40 yards. The third man dropped the satchel charge and ran. He rotated east. The assault group was 50 yards out and closing. He shot 3 times, hit twice, forced them to ground. Rotated north. The smoke group emerged from concealment. He shot twice, hit once, then his rifle ran dry. He dropped behind the slate barrier, grabbed another clip, reloaded. Bullets chipped stone around him. A ricochet caught his left forearm, shallow, burning. He ignored it. The Western machine gun kept firing, pinning him down. He couldn't return fire without exposing himself. The other groups were advancing during the suppression. In 30 seconds they'd reached the tower base. Acevedo grabbed a grenade, pulled the pin, counted 2 seconds, threw it blind through the western archway. The explosion silenced the machine gun. He rose, saw Germans at the base of the tower, shot down through the archway, hit 1, missed 2. They were trying to break down the door. He grabbed his last grenade, dropped it straight down. The wooden stairs amplified the explosion, sent Germans stumbling back. 1 fell, not moving. 2 others retreated, wounded. The assault broke. Germans pulled back to their original positions, dragging wounded, leaving 4 bodies in the open ground around the church. Acevedo counted heads. 29 Germans at start of engagement. Now maybe 18 still combat effective. He reloaded, checked his ammunition. 2 clips remaining, 16 rounds. Not enough for another assault. But he noticed something. In the confusion, Germans had left equipment behind. Rifles, ammunition belts, 1 MP-40 submachine gun lying next to a body 50 yards out. The MP-40. That changed calculations entirely. The Springfield was accurate but slow, 5 rounds before reload. The MP-40 carried 32 rounds of 9mm, fully automatic, devastating at close range. Acevedo studied the ground. The German body was in a slight depression, barely visible from German positions but exposed to the tower. Getting there would mean leaving the tower, crossing 40 yards of open ground, and hoping Germans were too disorganized to shoot straight. Staying meant fighting the next assault with 16 bullets. His father's voice: sometimes you gotta risk the whole engine to fix the one part that's broken. Acevedo climbed down from the tower. The church interior was dim, smelling of blood and fear. Patterson stared at him. "Stay down," Acevedo said. "I'll be back in 2 minutes. You're going outside? I need more ammunition." He went through the eastern door, rifle ready, moving fast and low. 30 yards. 20 yards. Bullet impacts around him, Germans reacting slowly. 10 yards. He reached the body, grabbed the MP-40, grabbed 2 spare magazines from the dead man's belt. Return trip was worse. Germans had located him now, concentrating fire. Bullets snapped past his head, hit the ground at his feet. He ran in a weaving pattern, burst through the church door, dove inside as machine gun fire chewed up the doorframe. "Jesus Christ," Patterson whispered. Acevedo checked the MP-40. German manufacture, Excellent condition, safety off, bolt forward, magazine seated. He racked the bolt. Ready. He climbed back to the tower with the MP40 slung over his shoulder and the Springfield in his hands. 2 weapons, different capabilities, more options. The Germans would come again. Had to. They'd committed to taking this position, lost too many men to walk away. German doctrine didn't allow retreat without authorization, and authorization would require admitting that one American corporal had stopped a full platoon assault. At 3:15 p.m. the Germans tried one more time. The final assault came from all directions simultaneously. Germans had learned their lesson about sequential attacks. Everything at once, overwhelming force, no tricks. Acevedo met them with the MP40. The Eastern group got within 40 yards before he opened fire, sweeping the weapon left to right, 32 rounds in 4 seconds. 3 Germans dropped. The others dove for cover, their advance stopped cold. He dropped the empty MP40, grabbed the Springfield, rotated north. Shot twice. 1 hit. Rotated west. Shot once. Mississippi. The rifle ran dry. He reloaded his last clip, 5 rounds, all the ammunition remaining. The Southern group was at the door again, trying to force it with rifle butts. He shot straight down through the bell tower floor. The wooden boards were old, rotten in places. His bullet punched through, hit something below. Someone screamed. The door assault stopped. The Germans pulled back. Final time. Acevedo waited for the next wave. It didn't come. Instead, at 3:47 p.m., American artillery opened up from positions southwest of town. The barrage hit German assembly areas, forcing them to disperse and seek cover. Under the artillery fire, a relief platoon from the 100th Infantry reached the church, lieutenants staring at the bodies scattered around the building. "What the hell happened here, Corporal?" the lieutenant asked. "Germans tried to take the church, sir. I suggested they reconsider." "How many?" "I counted 29. Maybe more." The lieutenant looked at Acevedo, at the tower, at the bodies, at the single rifle and empty MP40. "You held this position alone?" "The wounded couldn't move, sir. Someone had to stay." "For 6 hours?" "Yes, sir." "How many did you—" The lieutenant stopped, recalculated. "Corporal, there are 11 confirmed dead Germans around this church. Intelligence reports at least 6 wounded evacuated during the fight. You're telling me you did this yourself?" "I had a good position, sir. And they kept trying the same approach." The lieutenant walked around the church, examining angles and sight lines, finding the slate barriers in the tower, the bell rope sections, the improvised firing positions. When he came back down, he looked at Acevedo with something between respect and disbelief. "Write this up," the lieutenant said. "Every detail. What you did, how you did it, why it worked. Regiment's going to want to know." Acevedo wrote the report that night, sitting in a foxhole with a flashlight and a notebook, trying to explain 6 hours of combat in clinical terms. He described the bell tower's fields of fire, the rope pendulum distraction, the slate barriers, the calculated risk to recover German weapons. He wrote it matter-of-factly, no drama, just technical description of a defensive action. The report went to battalion, then regiment, then division. At each level, someone read it with increasing skepticism. One man holding a church tower against platoon-strength assault for 6 hours wasn't tactics. It was fantasy. Except the bodies were real. The wounded Germans in the field hospital confirmed the attack. And when intelligence officers interviewed German prisoners, they got the same story. American soldier in bell tower, impossible accuracy, unorthodox methods, broke 3 separate assaults. One German officer, a Hauptmann captured 2 days later, mentioned the engagement specifically. "That church was a simple clearing operation," he said during interrogation. "We had overwhelming numbers. The tower should have fallen in 20 minutes. But this soldier, he fought like he knew what we would do before we did it. He turned the building into a fortress using methods I've never seen. Very impressive. Very frustrating." Word spread through the 100th Infantry first. Acevedo had stayed when ordered to leave, held an impossible position, saved 42 wounded men. Soldiers started asking him questions. "How did you reload under fire? How did you track targets from multiple angles? How did you know where they'd attack next?" He answered reluctantly. "I watched how they moved. Germans follow doctrine. Once you know the doctrine, you know what's coming." He showed them the rope pendulum trick, demonstrated the slate barriers, explained sight angles and timing. "It's like tuning an engine," he said. "Every part moves in sequence. You just have to see the sequence." Other units heard about it. Officers from different battalions requested briefings. Acevedo gave the same technical explanation. Defensive positions, fields of fire, using enemy doctrine against them. Nobody officially approved his methods, but nobody told soldiers to stop listening either. By January 1944, infantrymen across the Fifth Army were adapting Aceveto's tower defense concepts to their own situations. Not the specific techniques, not every position had a bell tower or slate tiles, but the underlying principle. Understand enemy doctrine, create ambiguity, force them to slow down and think, use their hesitation against them. German commanders noticed the change. American defenses became unpredictable. Soldiers didn't always defend in textbook positions. They used buildings creatively, set up crossfires from unexpected angles, created false targets to draw fire. Attack success rates dropped. Casualty rates among assault troops increased. One German intelligence report from February 1944 mentioned improved American tactical flexibility in defensive operations, and noted that assault troops report increased difficulty identifying defensive positions and predicting defensive responses. The report didn't connect it to San Pietro specifically. It just documented that something had changed. Japanese intelligence, monitoring the Italian campaign closely, noted similar observations. They were particularly interested in urban combat tactics because they anticipated defending islands with fortified villages. Several reports mentioned American adaptations to building defense, crediting field innovations by unknown personnel. Unknown personnel. That was Acevedo. The report he'd written at San Pietro had been classified at division level, not for secrecy but because it described unauthorized tactics. The army didn't want soldiers improvising, even when improvisation worked. But the soldiers improvised anyway, learning from each other, spreading techniques through informal networks, changing how infantry fought without anyone officially teaching them to change. In March 1944, the infantry school at Fort Benning received a classified request from Fifth Army headquarters. Analyze defensive actions in Italian urban terrain and recommend tactical updates for training. The request included several after-action reports, including Aceveto's. A team of instructors studied the reports, tested the concepts, and found that unorthodox defensive methods consistently outperformed standard doctrine in close terrain. By June 1944, the infantry school had integrated some concepts into training, carefully rephrased to sound like official doctrine rather than borrowed field-expedient methods. They called it adaptive defense and terrain-oriented positioning. They didn't mention Aceveto's name or San Pietro. They just taught soldiers to think like he'd thought, to use buildings like he'd used the bell tower, to understand enemy doctrine and exploit its predictability. The 100th Infantry Battalion, meanwhile, continued fighting up the Italian peninsula with casualty rates that gradually decreased. 38% in their first 3 months. 29% in the next 3. 19% by spring 1944. Multiple factors contributed. Better air support, improved artillery coordination, weakening German resistance. But soldiers in the 100th knew another reason. They'd learned to fight smarter, to use terrain creatively, to defend positions that shouldn't be defensible. Conservative estimates credit those tactical changes with preventing approximately 200 casualties in the battalion over 6 months. Across the Fifth Army, where similar methods spread informally, the number might reach 2,000. 2,000 soldiers who went home instead of into graves, because one stubborn corporal decided the manual was wrong and proved it in a bell tower. Acevedo received no official recognition for San Pietro. The after-action report remained classified. His lieutenant recommended him for the Silver Star, but the recommendation got lost somewhere between regiment and division. Official records show he received a Purple Heart for the ricochet wound and a promotion to sergeant in January 1944. He never talked much about the tower. When soldiers asked, he gave technical explanations, demonstrated the tactics, helped them understand principles. But he didn't tell stories, didn't describe the fear or the exhaustion or the moments when he'd been certain the next assault would be the one that killed him. That wasn't useful information. They needed the methods, not the emotions. The numbers tell the story that official reports wouldn't. Defensive engagements in urban terrain, 5th Army, September-November 1943. American casualty rate 34%, average position held for 4.2 hours before withdrawal or reinforcement required. Defensive engagements in similar terrain, January-March 1944. Casualty rate 22%, average position held for 8.7 hours. That's a 35% reduction in casualties and more than double defensive endurance, occurring across multiple units and divisions. Something changed between late 1943 and early 1944. Training hadn't changed. Equipment hadn't improved significantly. Doctrine remained officially the same. What changed was implementation. Soldiers learned to defend differently, to use buildings as fortifications rather than just cover, to create overlapping fields of fire from unexpected positions, to understand enemy assault doctrine and counter it before contact. They learned these methods informally, passing them laterally through companies and battalions, never writing them down officially but applying them consistently. In the 100th Infantry Battalion specifically, defensive casualties dropped 41% between December 1943 and April 1944. The battalion's after-action reports credited improved tactical positioning and enhanced situational awareness. They didn't mention sergeants teaching other sergeants the bell tower principles, or corporals showing privates how to construct improvised barriers, or soldiers studying German doctrine to predict assaults. At Fort Benning, the infantry school analyzed the data without understanding all the sources. They documented improved defensive performance, recommended tactical modifications, and integrated some concepts into training programs. The June 1944 update to defensive tactics training included sections on urban position hardening and doctrine-based threat prediction that borrowed heavily from Aceveto's San Pietro report, though his name appeared nowhere in the documentation. The training update reached replacement troops heading to Europe for the Normandy invasion. Thousands of soldiers received instruction in defensive methods that originated in an Italian bell tower, taught by instructors who didn't know the origin, applied in French villages and German towns by men who'd never heard of San Pietro. German intelligence eventually connected the tactical shift to specific engagements. A report from 14th Army in Italy, dated May 1944, mentioned American defensive adaptation following engagements at San Pietro and surrounding areas, and noted that assault doctrine requires revision to account for unpredictable defensive positioning. The report recommended increased reconnaissance before assaults and greater use of indirect fire to suppress defenders without exposing assault troops. In other words, Germans adapted their tactics because American defenders had adapted theirs. The cycle of tactical evolution, action and reaction, each side learning from the other, all of it traceable back to one corporal who decided that 42 wounded men were worth risking a court-martial. Official documentation of Aceveto's specific action remained classified until 1961, when the Army declassified most non-strategic World War II records. By then, the tactical methods he'd pioneered were standard training, the infantry school taught them as established doctrine, and most soldiers who'd learned them in the field had either retired or died. Historians discovered the San Pietro report during research in the late 1960s. A graduate student at the Army War College, writing a dissertation on tactical innovation, found Aceveto's original after-action report in a box of declassified Fifth Army documents. The student recognized immediately that the techniques described had become standard defensive doctrine, that this one engagement had influenced how infantry fought for decades, and that nobody outside classified archives knew the story. The dissertation, published in 1970, credited Corporal Anthony Acevedo with pioneering adaptive defensive methods that influenced infantry tactics throughout the remainder of World War II and beyond. It estimated that his innovations contributed to saving between 1,000 and 3,000 American lives across multiple theaters of operation. Acevedo, by then living in Fresno and working as a crop duster pilot, declined to be interviewed for the dissertation. "I did my job," he told the graduate student who called him. "Other men did theirs. That's all." Anthony Acevedo survived the war. The 100th Infantry Battalion fought from Italy to France, absorbed into the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit in American military history. Acevedo fought with them until March 1945, when shrapnel from an artillery near burst sent him to a field hospital with wounds across his back and legs. He recovered in a hospital in Naples, shipped home in June 1945, and received his discharge at Fort MacArthur in San Pedro. Total service, 3 years, 8 months. Combat decorations: Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster, Bronze Star for Action in France, Good Conduct Medal. No mention of San Pietro in his discharge paperwork. The engagement had been classified, so officially it never happened. Aceveto's parents had been released from Gila River internment camp in January 1945. They returned to Los Angeles, found their house had been sold for unpaid taxes, and restarted their garage business in a rented building on East First Street. Anthony joined them, working as a mechanic while he figured out what to do with his civilian life. He didn't talk about the war. Friends would ask, customers would press for stories, other veterans would try to share experiences. He'd nod politely and change the subject. "Nobody wants to hear about that," he'd say. What he meant was that he didn't want to remember it, didn't want to explain to people who hadn't been there why he'd stayed in a tower when ordered to leave, or how it felt to shoot 29 men in 6 hours, or whether he thought the 42 lives he saved balanced against the German families who'd lost fathers and sons. In 1947 he married a woman named Grace Tanaka, whose family had also been interned during the war. They moved to Fresno, where Anthony found work as a crop duster pilot. The job combined mechanical skill, maintaining the aircraft, with a kind of solitary independence that suited him. He'd fly alone over the San Joaquin Valley, spraying pesticides on almond orchards and cotton fields, landing only to refuel and reload. He ran his own crop dusting business by 1953, employing 2 other pilots and maintaining a fleet of 3 Stearman biplanes. The business did well. He made a comfortable living, raised 3 children, attended their school events, coached Little League, lived the normal American life that he'd fought to preserve. Every December 15th, he'd drive to the coast alone. Grace knew why, never asked questions, just let him go. He'd sit on a beach near Santa Barbara, watching the Pacific, thinking about men whose names most Americans had never heard. Kondo, Fujimoto, Hayashi. The friends who died. The German soldiers he'd killed, who'd also been friends to someone. The 42 wounded men he'd saved, most of whose names he never learned. He never attended 100th Infantry Battalion reunions. Never joined veterans organizations. Never sought recognition or told his story publicly. When the graduate student found him in 1969 and asked about San Pietro, Aceveto's response was polite but final. I did what needed doing. So did everyone else. That's the whole story. Anthony Acevedo died on March 8, 1992 in Fresno, California, age 71. The cause was lung cancer, probably from decades of pesticide exposure. His obituary in the Fresno Bee ran 4 paragraphs. Born Los Angeles, served in World War II, operated crop dusting business, survived by wife and 3 children. One sentence mentioned his military service. Mr. Acevedo served with distinction in the 100th Infantry Battalion during World War II, receiving the Purple Heart and Bronze Star. No mention of San Pietro. No mention of the bell tower. No mention that his tactical innovations had influenced how American soldiers fought for half a century and saved thousands of lives. His family knew fragments of the story. His oldest son, researching family history in 2003, requested his father's military records and found the classified San Pietro report. He shared it with the Army War College, which added it to their tactical innovation archives. Modern Special Forces instructors sometimes use the engagement as a case study in adaptive defense and understanding enemy doctrine. But most Americans who benefit from the tactical methods Acevedo pioneered have never heard his name. They don't know that defensive infantry tactics they learn in basic training originated in an Italian bell tower. They don't know that one stubborn corporal, willing to risk court-martial for what he knew was right, changed how the army fights. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees reviewing proposals and generals authorizing new doctrine. Through corporals who see the problem clearly, understand the solution intuitively, and have the courage to act when action means risking everything. Anthony Acevedo wasn't supposed to stay at that church. He wasn't supposed to fight alone for 6 hours against platoon-strength assault. He wasn't supposed to survive, wasn't supposed to win, wasn't supposed to change infantry tactics for a generation. The manual said none of it should have worked. But Acevedo had learned from his father that manuals describe how things are supposed to work, not how they actually work. Every machine has its own personality. Every situation requires adaptation. And sometimes you have to break the rules to fix what's broken. On December 15, 1943, what was broken was tactical doctrine that got Americans killed predictably. What Acevedo fixed was the doctrine itself, using nothing but stubbornness, a Springfield rifle, and the absolute conviction that 42 wounded men deserved better than abandonment. The 42 men he saved went home to families who never knew how close they'd come to losing their fathers, brothers, sons. The thousands of soldiers who survived because training incorporated his methods never knew where those methods originated. That's exactly how Acevedo wanted it. He wasn't fighting for recognition. He was fighting because someone had to, because the manual was wrong, because men he knew were dying for no good reason. That's the story of San Pietro. Not glory or heroism. Just one stubborn mechanic's son who refused to let doctrine override common sense, who understood that saving lives matters more than following rules, and who proved that sometimes the best way to fight is to ignore everything you were taught and trust what you know is true. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and if you know other stories like this that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.